the one they called the Shadow. The probationary nurse who moved through the hallways of Ridgemont General without making a sound. The one the charge nurse had assigned to linen inventory because, as Dr. Nurse had assigned to linen inventory because, Calloway put it, she seemed better suited to counting pillowcases than touching patients, was already pulling the fire alarm with one hand and dialing emergency services with the other before the second explosion tore through the east wing. Nobody looked at Nurse Cora Sutton twice. That had always been the point. She'd arrived at Ridgemont General Hospital in Sudbury, Ontario 14 weeks earlier with a single duffel bag, a letter of conditional employment, and a face that gave away nothing. 32 years old, 5'4", brown hair pulled into a knot so practical it bordered on institutional. She spoke when spoken to, smiled at patients with a steadiness that the other nurses mistook for vacancy, and she never, not once, pushed back when the charge nurse handed her the worst assignments. Dr. Sedman. Calloway had made his opinion of her clear on her third day. She'd been restocking the supply cart outside room 14 when he'd stopped in the hallway, looked her up and down with the particular brand of contempt that medical hierarchies seem to manufacture in bulk, and said to Dr. Osei, she remembered the name because Osei had at least looked uncomfortable about it, who approved the hire. She looks like she's never seen the inside of a trauma bay. Osei had said nothing. Cora had kept counting gauze pads. What Calloway didn't know, what nobody at Ridgemont General knew, was that Cora Sutton had spent 6 years as a combat medic with the Canadian Armed Forces, 2 tours in a forward operating base outside of Kandahar where the trauma bay was whatever flat surface wasn't on fire, and 1 classified deployment that she was still, technically, not allowed to discuss in detail. She had worked on patients in conditions that would make the spotless halls of Ridgemont look like a spa. She had kept people alive with field dressings and a tourniquet and the particular kind of calm that doesn't come from training alone. It comes from having already lost people and deciding that you will not lose this one. She had left the military quietly. That was also the point. The nursing degree was real. The probationary status was real. The rest of it, the hesitation she performed when a senior nurse spoke to her, the way she deferred to Calloway even when he was wrong about a patient's fluid levels, which he was twice in her first month alone, was a choice. She was tired. She had come to Sudbury because her sister lived there, because it was far from the places she'd been, and because a hospital in a mid-sized northern Ontario city seemed like the kind of place where nothing would happen. She had been almost right. The morning it changed started like every other morning on the unit. Cora arrived at 0640, 20 minutes before her shift, changed into scrubs, and reviewed the overnight handoff notes. She had 4 patients, room 7, post-op hip replacement, recovering well. Room 9, pneumonia, 68 years old, requiring close monitoring. Room 11, which was empty but being prepped for an incoming transfer. Room 14, the one that mattered. Room 14 held a man named Bernard Leclerc, 54, admitted 3 days earlier with chest pain that the attending had attributed to stress and planned to discharge by noon. Cora had reviewed his chart twice and said nothing to anyone because she had learned, in 14 weeks, that saying something was received about as well as showing up uninvited. But she had written a note in the system, carefully, specifically, flagging that his oxygen saturation had dropped twice overnight in patterns that didn't match the stress presentation, and that his peripheral edema was inconsistent with the admitting diagnosis. The note sat there. Nobody responded to it. She was checking Leclerc's blood pressure at 0821, when she felt it more than heard it. A concussive pressure change, low and resonant, that moved through the floor beneath her feet. It came from below. The cafeteria was 1 floor down. Leclerc looked at her. What was that? Stay here, she said. She set down the cuff and was already moving. In the hallway, the overhead lights flickered. One of the nurses at the station, a young woman named Pettit, who'd been kind to Cora in the small ways that mattered, was standing with her hand pressed to the wall, looking toward the stairwell. 2 of the medical residents were in the corridor. One of them, tall, 3rd year, Cora had heard him called Marchetti, had gone completely white. Explosion, Cora said, not a question. East stairwell or below. Everyone stays on this floor. Get the charge nurse. Marchetti looked at her like she'd spoken in a foreign language, which was fair, she supposed, because in 14 weeks she had never spoken like that to anyone. She went to the stairwell. The smoke came first, gray and low, seeping under the door from below. She pushed through into a wave of heat and the particular smell she had hoped never to smell again. Burning insulation, scorched concrete, and underneath it, the sharper, copper-edged scent that her body recognized before her brain finished processing it. She went down. The cafeteria had taken the blast on its east side, near the service entrance. Tables overturned. Glass across the floor in sheets. A section of the ceiling had come down, and beneath it, 3 people were visible. 1 unconscious against the far wall, 2 trying to move. A 4th person, a kitchen worker, was standing in the middle of the room making a sound that wasn't quite screaming, holding one arm at an angle that meant the bone was involved. Cora moved to the unconscious person first because that was triage, because that was always triage. Male, 50s, head laceration, breathing shallow but present. She checked pulse, checked airway, stabilized his neck with both hands, and looked around for something rigid enough to serve as a collar. Found a serving tray. Made it work. The 2 who were trying to move. A woman in a hospital volunteer vest. An elderly man who'd been eating breakfast. She directed to the far wall, away from the structural damage, assessing both in under 90 seconds. The volunteer had a deep laceration on her forearm that needed pressure and elevation. The elderly man had a possible fractured wrist and was in shock, but ambulatory. Press here, she told the volunteer, guiding her hand to the wound. Don't let go. Keep your arm up. Talk to him. Keep him with you. The kitchen worker with the compound fracture was the hardest. Because compound fractures are the hardest. Not because of the blood, which Cora had learned to metabolize, but because of the pain response, which makes patients unpredictable. She got him seated, got his arm immobilized using strips of her own scrub jacket tied around a section of aluminum shelving that had come off the wall, and kept her voice at a register she had used in other places, in other contexts, that she had learned would reach people even when the adrenaline was making them unreachable. I need you to look at me, she said. Not at your arm, at me. He looked at her. Good. You're going to be okay. I need you to stay exactly like this. She was already moving back toward the unconscious man when she found the device. It was wedged beneath one of the overturned tables, partially concealed by a collapsed section of ceiling tile, and she stopped completely when she saw it, because her body stopped before her mind did. It was not large, it was not complicated. It was exactly the type of device that a specific instructor, a man named Garrett, former RCMP, who had run a 2-week counter-IED course at CFB Gagatown 7 years ago, had shown her a photograph of in a classroom that smelled like old coffee. She stood very still for 3 seconds. Then she did what Garrett had taught her to do. She assessed without touching. Size, configuration, visible components. She identified the power source. She identified what appeared to be the trigger mechanism. She thought about the blast pattern from the first explosion and where it had originated, and what that told her about the placement of a second device, and why someone would choose this particular room in this particular hospital. Her hands were steady. They had always been steady. That was something she'd never had to learn. She pulled out her phone and called the numbers she had been told 7 years ago she should never need to call. It rang twice. Sutton, she said when it picked up. I'm at Ridgemont General in Sudbury. I've got a secondary device, cafeteria level. First device already detonated east side, structural damage contained. Secondary appears intact. I need EOD and I need the building evacuated now. There was a pause. Then, hold position. She held position. She held position. The evacuation alarm went off 40 seconds later, which meant someone upstairs had already called it in and the response was already moving. She could hear the overhead system activating, the distant sound of staff voices shifting from confused to directed. She stayed with the device and stayed with her 4 casualties, checking the unconscious man every 90 seconds, keeping her voice on the kitchen worker, watching the volunteers improvise dressing for saturation. Dr. Calloway arrived 14 minutes after the first explosion. She heard him before she saw him. His voice carrying from the stairwell, authoritative in the particular way that men like Calloway are authoritative in situations they do not understand, which is to say confidently and incorrectly. Clear the entire floor. I'm the senior attending on shift. He came through the door and stopped. Cora was kneeling beside the unconscious patient, 2 fingers on his carotid, watching his chest. Calloway looked around the room, at the 4 casualties stabilized and positioned, at the improvised cervical support, at the fractured arm, immobilized with what appeared to be cafeteria shelving and strips of blue scrub fabric, at the overturned table that Cora had not touched, and the section of floor beneath it that she had cordoned off with chairs from the far side of the room, positioned in a loose perimeter that Calloway would not have known was a standoff distance but was. He looked at Cora. She did not look back at him. She was still watching Leclerc. No, not Leclerc, the unconscious man. She kept mixing up the rooms in her mind, the way she always did when she shifted into this mode, when everything became a task and a task and a task and a task. Sutton. Calloway's voice had changed. The secondary device is under that table, she said without turning. Don't go past the chairs. EOD is 7 minutes out, I was told. Evacuation is in progress. These 4 need transport as soon as the corridor is clear. Priority is the male, unconscious, probable TBI, neck stabilized but needs imaging immediately. The arm is compound, secondary. The other 2 are stable. Calloway said nothing for a long moment. Then, how do you know there's a second device? Because I looked for one. She said it simply, without edge, the way she said everything in this mode. She wasn't performing calm. She just was calm. It was the same calm that had gotten her through a medical bay with 4 critical patients and no electricity and a dust storm making visibility 3 meters, and she had no more ability to turn it off than she had to turn off her heartbeat. Calloway stepped back from the chairs. He stayed back. The ERD team arrived in 9 minutes, not 7. Cora met them at the stairwell door and gave them the briefing she would have given her commanding officer. Compact. Accurate, no filler. Device location, dimensions, visible components. What she had and hadn't touched, the blast pattern from the first explosion. Her assessment of the trigger mechanism. Her confidence level on each point, which she expressed as percentages because that was the language the team used and she knew the language. The team lead, a woman in full protective gear whose name tape read Beausoleil, looked at her for a moment after the briefing. Armed forces? Formerly, Cora said. Which unit? Cora gave her a look that Beausoleil read correctly because Beausoleil had probably given the same look herself. Copy that, Beausoleil said, and went to work. The device was rendered safe in 22 minutes. The first responders cleared the building systematically. Cora's 4 casualties were transported. The unconscious man to the trauma bay, the others to the emergency department for assessment. She gave the paramedics a handoff on each one that the lead paramedic, a young man whose name tag said Lacroix, wrote down in his notebook without interrupting once, which she appreciated. She was standing in the parking lot when the police officer found her, Constable something. She didn't catch the name. She was tired. The adrenaline was metabolizing, and she could feel it going, the way it always went, like a tide pulling back. He asked her what had happened, and she told him, precisely, everything she could, the sequence, the decisions, the rationale for each one. She told him about the note in Leclerc's chart, the real Leclerc, upstairs, whose blood pressure she had never finished taking, because she wanted someone on record knowing that the note existed. The constable wrote everything down. He kept looking up at her between sentences with an expression she recognized. She had seen it on the faces of people who thought they already understood a situation and were recalculating. The hospital administrator came out 20 minutes later. His name was Fontaine, and he had the look of a man who had rehearsed a speech during the walk from the building to the parking lot and was now uncertain whether the speech applied. Nurse Sutton, he said, I've spoken with EOD and the responding officers. I understand that you. He stopped, started again. The assessment you provided appears to have been instrumental in. He stopped again. Cora waited. I owe you an apology. Fontaine said, which was not what she'd expected. The note in Leclerc's chart from 3 days ago. My team should have followed up on that. We're running that now. She looked at him. Is he okay? Fontaine pulled out his phone, checked something. They're running an echo. Cardiology is with him. Good, she said. She looked at the building. The east wing had a section of blown-out windows on the ground floor. The glass caught the morning light in a way that was almost beautiful from this distance. An ambulance was pulling away from the side entrance. No sirens, which meant whoever was inside was stable enough. She hoped it was the kitchen worker with the arm. She hoped he had someone to call. Dr. Herferal Calloway came out of the building 15 minutes after Fontaine. He walked toward her with the deliberate pace of a man composing himself, and she turned to face him because it seemed like the right thing to do. He stopped a few feet away. He looked like he had looked in the cafeteria, recalculating. I made some assumptions about you, he said. Yes, she said. That was not professional of me. She considered that for a moment. It was not, she thought, the most important thing that had happened today. And it was not the apology she most needed, because the most important thing he had done wrong was override her clinical note about Leclerc. And the most important thing she needed was for someone to follow up on it, which Fontaine had already said was happening. But she also recognized that Calloway was standing in a hospital parking lot at 9 in the morning, having just witnessed something that had rearranged his understanding of a person he had categorized and filed away. And that rearrangement costs people something, even people who should have known better. Okay, she said. He nodded. He went back inside. She stayed in the parking lot a while longer. The morning had gone cold and bright the way Sudbury mornings do in late October. The kind of light that makes everything look newly rendered, like the world had been redrawn overnight. A blue jay landed on a concrete barrier near the ambulance bay and sat there doing nothing in particular. Her phone buzzed. It was her sister, Margot, who must have seen something on the news. Are you at the hospital? What happened? Are you okay? Cora typed back. I'm fine. I'll call you tonight. She pocketed the phone and looked at the building. She thought about the first time she'd triaged 3 casualties simultaneously, in a compound in Kandahar in 2017, with dust in her eyes and radio traffic in her ear, and a soldier calling out a 4th casualty from behind a wall she couldn't reach. She had been 25. She had not been calm because she was trained. She had been calm because she understood, with a clarity that no amount of peace would ever fully dull, that the person in front of her was alive right now, and her job was to keep them that way. She thought about Leclerc upstairs, waiting for his echo results. She thought about the note she had written 3 days ago, the one that had sat in the system unanswered, and she made a decision she had been putting off since the day she arrived. She was going back inside. She was going to be on time for her afternoon shift. She was going to tell the charge nurse politely, specifically, without apology, that she expected her clinical notes to receive a response within 24 hours, that she was not going to stop writing them, and that if there was a process for escalating clinical concerns, she intended to use it. She was also going to check on Leclerc herself, cardiology or not. The blue jay flew off the concrete barrier and disappeared over the tree line. The parking lot smelled like exhaust and frost. Somewhere inside the building, her patients were waiting. Nurse Cora Sutton straightened her jacket, walked to the entrance, and pushed through the door.